In 1995, 3 young nuns vanished during a routine retreat at a secluded convent in Oregon, their disappearance dismissed as voluntary silence. But 25 years later, a quiet priest uncovers a sealed basement, and with it, the buried remnants of a faith betrayed. The mist hung low over the old chapel grounds as Father Michael Rowe stepped through the threshold he once called sacred. The road leading up to St. Bellamy Abbey twisted through thick pine forests, climbing steadily toward the quiet solitude of Oregon's mountain interior. It was the kind of path that demanded silence, that pulled words back into the chest and asked travelers to listen instead, to the wind hissing through the trees, the cry of a distant bird, the gravel crunching beneath tires. On July 17, 1995, 3 women arrived at the Abbey's old iron gate in a faded blue van, with the emblem of the diocese painted on the side. Sister Genevieve Morales stepped out first. At 49, she carried the quiet authority of someone used to being listened to. Behind her came Sister Claudia Rowe, younger by 15 years, a stern but kind woman whose gaze always seemed a little too sharp for her soft features. Last was Emily, Claudia's younger sister, 22 and newly professed. She was still adjusting to the quiet rituals of religious life, the silences, the structure. Yet she radiated a kind of brightness that even the gray stone walls of St. Bellamy couldn't dull. The Abbey hadn't seen regular use in nearly a decade. It was built in the 1930s, originally as a retreat center for contemplative orders. After a fire in the 70s and years of reduced funding, it fell into partial disuse. Now, the diocese occasionally opened it for special silent retreats, usually small, intimate groups needing time away. The 3 women had been sent for precisely that, a week of solitude, reflection, and discernment. According to church records, Sister Genevieve had requested the retreat after a long period of emotional exhaustion. Claudia and Emily volunteered to accompany her. The Abbey's caretaker, Sister Helen Brandt, was the only other person staying on site. She lived in a small side cottage and handled basic maintenance and meals. She kept a sparse logbook, mostly noting deliveries and weather. July 17th, she wrote, 3 arrived, unloaded supplies, quiet. The next entry came 4 days later. No sign of them this morning, all rooms empty, no explanation, no elaboration. Sister Helen didn't call the authorities. Instead, she contacted the diocesan office in Portland and informed Father Benjamin Kessler, the director of retreat ministries. His response was measured. Perhaps they left early, he told her. They were under no obligation to remain the full week. He asked her to lock the main building and await further instructions. Meanwhile, back in Salem, Michael Rowe was getting ready to fly back to Rome. He had been in the States for a few weeks to renew his religious visa and attend a short theology conference. As he packed, he tried one last time to call his sisters. Claudia and Emily hadn't returned any of his 3 previous messages. That in itself wasn't alarming. They were often busy, and retreats usually involved unplugging. Still, something felt off. Claudia was not someone who ignored family, especially not Michael. The Rowes had always been close, more like an inseparable trio than siblings. He left a message on the voicemail at their convent in Eugene. Just checking in before I fly out. I'll call again when I land. Hope the retreat went well. He never got a call back. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that he found out they were missing. An old friend from seminary, now working part-time with the Portland diocese, called him late at night, unsure how much he was allowed to share. It's probably nothing, the friend said. But they didn't return from that Abbey retreat. The file says they chose to remain in solitude elsewhere. Michael was stunned. Who signed off on that? He asked. The friend didn't know. The file was thin, bare bones, just a note from Father Kessler saying the sisters had expressed interest in extending their time in private discernment, and that no last letters, no initiated by them. No last letters, no indication of destination, no forwarding address. The more Michael pushed, the more evasive the responses became. When he called Father Kessler directly, the priest was cordial but closed. Sometimes people leave religious life, he said. Sometimes they do it quietly. But all 3? Michael asked. Together? It happens. Claudia would never leave without telling me. Emily, you should let it rest, Kessler interrupted gently. The church has no reason to suspect wrongdoing. You haven't even filed a report. Because there is no report to file. They are adults. They chose silence. That word returned again and again over the following months. When Michael contacted the sheriff's office in Marlin Ridge, they confirmed no missing persons report had been filed, and when he offered to file one himself, the deputy asked for proof the women hadn't left voluntarily. You're telling me 3 grown women with no luggage, no cash, and notice that doesn't strike anyone as suspicious. Summaries don't have jurisdiction over church matters, the deputy replied. Michael began calling the few people he knew who had spent time at St. Bellamy. One former retreatant said she remembered the place being creepy and cold, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. It always felt like no one really watched what went on there. Another nun who had served as cook in the late 80s said the lower levels were sometimes used for penitential isolation, though she couldn't confirm if that continued in later years. Over time, the silence around St. Bellamy deepened. The retreat center officially closed in 1998 due to budget constraints. The diocese kept the land, but let it sit unused. The Rowe sisters were never officially declared missing, but within their order they were listed as released from active vocation by personal choice. To the world, they had simply chosen another path. To Michael, they had vanished. By the time Michael Rowe returned to Oregon in the early summer of 1996, nearly 11 months had passed since his sister's supposed departure from religious life. He had spent the better part of a year immersed in theological course at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, following a tightly packed schedule that often left little room for personal reflection. Still, their absence gnawed at him in quiet moments, the unanswered letters, the lack of acknowledgement, the abrupt silence from Claudia and Emily. At first, he told himself they were simply busy. Life in religious orders was often structured, isolating. But after weeks turned into months, his thoughts darkened. In Rome, he had sent 4 handwritten letters, 2 to Claudia, 1 to Emily, and 1 addressed jointly to their convent. None were returned, and none elicited a response. When he called the convent once, he was told simply, "They are not with us anymore, Father." No elaboration, no forwarding details. He felt the message was delivered with the firmness of a closed door. Back in the U.S., Michael's first stop was the Convent of the Sacred Mercy in Eugene, where both Claudia and Emily had been based for over 5 years. He arrived unannounced, dressed in his clerical collar, and was greeted at the front desk by a young sister named Agnes. She recognized his last name and seemed to tense slightly before forced a practiced smile. "Father Rowe," she said, "I believe Mother Lucia is expecting you." That alone gave him pause. He hadn't informed anyone of his return. In the convent's modest but ornately receiving room, Mother Lucia entered wearing the air of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. Her demeanor was courteous but cautious. "We heard you might be coming back," she said. "I'm sorry it couldn't be under better circumstances." Michael didn't sit. "Where are my sisters?" he asked. The Mother Superior folded her hands. "They departed from the order in July last year. There was a discernment period. It was their decision." "And no one thought to tell me? They expressed the desire to begin a new chapter privately. The Church respects such wishes." Michael exhaled slowly. "Did they leave together?" "Yes," she replied, "from St. Bellamy Abbey, and since then no contact." He asked to see their rooms. There was a pause, and then Mother Lucia nodded. "Follow me." Emily's room was the smaller of the two, modest, simple, a twin bed, a wooden crucifix above the desk, and a narrow wardrobe. What struck Michael immediately was how intact everything looked. Her clothes were neatly hung, her shoes aligned perfectly under the bed. The desk held a stack of unopened letters, 3 of them were his. "You didn't forward these?" he asked. "We didn't know where to send them," the mother replied softly. Claudia's room was similar but more personalized. A set of rosary beads Michael had gifted her on her final vows lay on the nightstand. Her Bible was bookmarked at the Psalms. A notebook sat closed on her desk. Inside were sermon outlines, quotations from Thomas Merton, and a draft of a letter, addressed to him, but never finished. "They didn't pack a single thing," he murmured. "This doesn't look like someone who left." He spent the next several days quietly interviewing those who had last seen them. A kitchen assistant recalled Claudia and Genevieve looking troubled before the retreat. Another sister remembered Emily crying the night before they left, though no one knew why. One elderly nun, Sister Colette, pulled Michael aside and said in a hushed voice, "Not everyone who went to St." When pressed, she clammed up, whispering only, "That place changes people." Michael returned to Portland and requested a formal audience with the diocesan's office. He came prepared with dates, timelines, and the list of personal items left untouched. He was told that the case had already been closed. The church had no reason to suspect foul play. They offered a few platitudes about prayer and discernment, but no substance. The file on his sisters contained only a single letter signed by Father Benjamin Kessler, the same priest who had overseen retreat logistics. It stated simply, "The sisters have chosen voluntary release from vocation. No further inquiries necessary." There was no exit interview, no independent verification, no transportation record. Michael found it deeply troubling. He then attempted to meet with Father Kessler in person. The priest was polite but dismissive. "They made a personal choice," he said. "It happens more often than you think." All three? At the same time? Sometimes the Spirit moves people together. And they didn't take anything? Leave anything? Not even say goodbye to their own brother? Kessler smiled gently. "That's the nature of the call, Father Rowe. It defies explanation." Michael didn't buy it. On instinct, he drove east to Maryland Ridge, the mountain town nearest St. Bellamy. The town hadn't changed much. Logging trucks still passed through its two-lane roads. The diner still had the same faded menu posted above the counter. At the sheriff's office, he asked if any missing persons reports had ever been filed from the Abbey. The clerk scanned the logbook and shook her head. "Nothing from St. Bellamy. You sure about the year?" "95, Michael confirmed. "July. Close we got was a call in September," the clerk said. "Caretaker reported hearing voices near the back lot. Turned out to be hikers." That gave Michael pause. The back lot of the Abbey led into National Forest. It wasn't accessible to the public. Something didn't add up. He drove up to the property line of St. Bellamy the next morning. The main gates were chained, and a faded wooden sign hung crookedly, "Property of Diocese, no entry." Through the trees, he could see the outline of the Abbey's upper structure, stone walls weathered by decades of rain and wind. He stood there for a long time, gripping the chain, staring through. He didn't know what he was looking for. A shadow, a flicker, a sign that the walls held memory. Then he saw it, a curtain move in one of the upper windows. Just a ripple. It could have been wind. Or it could have been something else. Michael backed away, heart pounding, mind racing. He didn't have answers, not yet, but he had questions that no one else seemed willing to ask, and he was done waiting for permission. He made a vow to himself then, standing at the edge of that forgotten ground, he would find out what happened inside those walls. Even if it meant going through them. Michael stood at the edge of the locked gates of St. Bellamy, staring at the weathered stone facade just visible through the pine canopy. The faint movement he thought he saw in the window had long since faded, but it continued to echo in his thoughts. It could have been nothing, or it could have been someone watching. Either way, it solidified something within him. He had questions, and no one in authority seemed willing to answer them. The next morning he drove to the diocesan office in Portland, a modern building with polished stone floors and framed portraits of former bishops lining the hallways. He had no appointment, but his collar and last name were still recognized in most church spaces. Within 30 minutes he was sitting in a quiet office across from Monsignor Harold Bryan, a senior administrator who had worked in the chancery for over 2 decades. Bruin reviewed a folder in front of him with minimal interest. "Father Rowe, as I explained on the phone, there is no investigation underway because there is no criminal matter on record. The sisters left voluntarily and there were no reports of harm or coercion." Michael kept his voice even. "And you determined all that without speaking to their family, or even looking into their personal effects?" Their decision was submitted to the order. The diocese has no authority over the personal choices of vowed religious. They are adults. They chose to leave. No crime has occurred. They left behind everything they owned, letters, journals, even their rosaries. No goodbyes, no destination. Doesn't that at least merit a welfare check? Not if they expressed their intent to remove themselves from ministry, Bryn replied. "We have a signed letter from Father Kessler stating as much." And no one ever spoke directly to the women? Michael asked. No one saw them write that letter? No one checked on them after they left the abbey? Father, I understand this is painful for you, Brunette said, his tone softening slightly. But the Church is not in the business of chasing down every nun who decides to leave the convent. 3 women disappeared, Michael said quietly. My sister's among them. That's not just a vocational change, that's a pattern. Then take it up with law enforcement, Brine said, closing the file. But I can assure you from our side, the matter is closed. Michael left the office feeling no closer to the truth, but more certain than ever that something had been buried, not just administratively, but physically. Over the next few weeks, he reached out to anyone who had previously spent time at St. Bellamy. Most were reluctant to speak, a few gave vague answers. It was a quiet place, we didn't interact much, there were rules about speaking during retreats. Finally, at a retirement home near Eugene, he found a woman who gave him more than silence. Sister Anne Marie had served the Church for over 50 years, most of them in educational roles, but had also briefly assisted at the Abbey in the late 80s when it was still in regular use. She was nearly blind now, her voice slow but firm. When Michael introduced himself, she didn't react to his title, but her face changed when he said Claudia's name. I remember her, she said, sharp eyes, always asking the right questions. Not afraid of truth. She and my other sister disappeared after a retreat there, Michael said. The Church says they left. I don't believe that. Sister Anne Marie nodded slowly. That place was not for everyone. We used to joke it was where difficult sisters were sent to think. You mean like a punishment? No, not punishment, just away. Solitude, they called it. Extended contemplation, if the mother house had doubts about your fit for ministry. And did they come back? Michael asked. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Some, not all. You mean they left religious life? No, she said. I mean, I don't know what happened to them. One year I went up to assist with laundry and meals. There were 5 sisters in retreat. By the time I left, there were 3. No one said anything. I asked once, and I was told not to question matters above my station. Michael felt a chill crawl down his spine. Was Father Kessler there? Yes, he was always there, quiet man, watched more than he spoke. She paused. The chapel basement had a door I wasn't allowed to open. Said it was for archives, but it was always locked from the outside. Michael drove back to St. Bellamy that afternoon and parked just beyond the tree line, out of view from the road. The Abbey's stone walls rose against the sky, weathered but intact. He knew he couldn't break in, not yet, but he needed to understand the layout better. Using old survey maps from the county clerk's office, he traced the original design of the building, a central chapel, 2 side dormitories, a kitchen hall, and a maintenance wing. There was also a sub-level storage unit marked beneath the chapel. No blueprint revisions appeared after 1984. He wondered what Sister Anne Mary meant about the door being locked from the outside. That wasn't standard for archives. He noted that the last time the property taxes had been updated was in 2015, and even that was a minimal amount, just enough to keep the land legally owned. The diocese clearly had no intention of developing it again, but they also hadn't let it go. That alone felt suspicious. At night, Michael stayed in a budget motel 20 minutes away. He made lists, reviewed his notes, and contacted his seminary friend again in Portland. You won't get them to talk, the friend said. No one wants a scandal, and without a body or a report, it's just hearsay. Then maybe it's time someone files a report. And say what? My sister's left the convent, and I don't believe it. That won't get you a warrant. That'll get you a polite laugh. If I find proof they never left, how are you going to do that? Michael paused. I don't know yet, but I will. The next morning he received a phone call from a blocked number. A female voice, elderly, thin, said only one sentence before hanging up. If you want answers, check the laundry records. Not even the sister at the home had mentioned them. He wrote the phrase down in his notebook, underlined it, and stared at it for a long moment. It was the first time someone had given him something concrete. He didn't know where the laundry records were kept, but he had a guess. The chapel, the basement, the locked door. If no one else was going to open it, maybe he would have to. The morning mist clung low over the treetops as Michael's car crept up the winding road toward what had once been St. Bellamy Abbey. It was late October 2020, and the air carried the scent of pine needles and cold, damp stone. 25 years had passed since Claudia and Emily had disappeared inside this place, and now, for the first time, the gate stood open. Not for the church, but for something else entirely. A faded sign near the entrance read, "Haven Ridge Renewal Center, private retreats and psychological workshops." The diocese had finally sold the property in 2018, and since then, the new owners had partially renovated the structure into a therapeutic retreat facility specializing in cognitive resilience training. To Michael, the rebranding felt like putting flowers on a gravestone. He parked beside a gravel path lined with potted ferns and approached the main building. The exterior hadn't changed much. Same moss-covered stones, same sharp corners. Inside, however, new paint and commercial lighting softened the shadows that once dominated its halls. At the front desk, a young woman with a clipboard looked up. "Are you here for the weekend session?" she asked. Michael shook his head. "Actually, I was hoping to speak to someone about the building itself. I used to know this place when it was still under the church." She glanced at his collar, no longer worn daily but always kept in his jacket pocket. "A moment," she said. A few minutes later, a man in his 50s appeared, broad-shouldered, khakis, navy polo, with the Haven Ridge logo embroidered near the collar. "Mark Cullen," he introduced himself. "Operations Director. You said you're familiar with the Abbey?" Michael nodded. "I'm a priest, or was. My sister stayed here in 1995 and never came back. I'm looking for any information about this building that might not be in the church's records." Cullen gave him a long look, then motioned him down a side hallway. "We found something when we started tearing out the old flooring. Figured it was part of the original design, but, well, no one had any blueprints." Michael followed him past a yoga room and a row of therapy offices into a wing marked "Under Renovation." Dust hung in the air, and tools lay in corners. Callan led him to the old library, now stripped of shelves but still carrying the scent of old paper and mildew. He pointed to the back wall. This whole section was hidden behind a floor-to-ceiling bookcase. "Didn't think much of it until one of our workers realized the paneling wasn't load-banging." He stepped aside to reveal a section of wall that looked newer than the surrounding stone. "We pulled it off and found this." He knocked twice, and a hollow sound answered back. A wooden door, vertical slats, no knob, no handle. Just a rectangle of wood flush with the wall, sealed at its edges with bent nails, and a strip of aging paint. Michael stepped closer. "Was it locked?" Cullen replied. "We opened it. You'll want to see this." He produced a flashlight and handed it to Michael, then used a crowbar to gently pry the door open. A groan echoed as hinges resisted, then gave way. Beyond was a narrow staircase, descending into darkness. Cold air rose to meet them, smelling of damp concrete and rust. Michael descended first, flashlight beam trembling slightly as he moved. The stairs were stone, chipped and worn in the middle from decades of use. At the bottom, the narrow passage opened into a room, rectangular, low ceiling, concrete walls. A single rusted bed frame sat along the far wall. A bucket, a broken chair, what looked like a small wooden table lay in one corner. On the table, coated in dust, sat a ceramic cup and a cracked mirror. The air was heavy, silent. Michael took a slow step forward, sweeping the light across the room. In one corner, he saw scratches on the wall, vertical lines grouped in clusters of 5, dozens of clusters. Hundreds of marks. Cullen exhaled behind him. "We thought it might have been storage, but then we found this." He pointed to the bed. The mattress had rotted away, but underneath, wedged between the frame and wall, was a piece of fabric. Michael reached out carefully and pulled it free. It was part of a veil, black, with a small stitched cross at the edge. Familiar. Too familiar. Cullen said nothing. Michael turned and looked around the room again, heart pounding. There were no windows, no natural light, no evidence of heating or ventilation, just a faint iron grate in the ceiling's corner, perhaps once connected to an old duct. "Someone was kept here," he said. Cullen nodded. "We reported it to the county when we found it, just to be safe. They sent someone, took a few pictures, but said without signs of a crime or human remains, there wasn't much to do." They chalked it up to old church practices, penitential isolation, or something like that. "No one's used this room in decades," Michael said. "That mattress was from the '80s. Maybe earlier," Cullen added. "We found a rosary too. It's in my office. One of the nurses said it looked hand-carved." "You want to see it?" Michael nodded slowly. As they climbed back up the stairs, Cullen added, "We haven't publicized any of this. Didn't seem right to turn it into some marketing angle." In his office, Cullen opened a drawer and retrieved a small plastic evidence bag. Inside was a wooden rosary, each bead imperfect, worn from touch. The crucifix had initials carved faintly on the back, CR. Michael held the bag for a long moment, throat tight. "Claudia Rowe," Michael said. "She was here." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Cullen added, "One of the crew mentioned something odd. Said the door, before we opened it, had scratch marks on the inside, near the lock, like someone tried to pry it open with a nail or something." Michael stared at the floor. "How many rooms like that do you think are still buried in places like this?" Cullen didn't answer. After a moment, he stood and motioned toward a file on his desk. "He documented everything. If you want copies, you can take them. I don't think anyone ever wanted this found." Michael nodded. Someone tried very hard to keep it hidden, and as he left the office, the veil still folded in his coat pocket, he realized he had been wrong about one thing. This wasn't a disappearance. It was containment. Voluntary silence made no sense anymore. This was deliberate removal. And the next question wasn't why. It was how many others had been kept from leaving. Michael returned to the library the following morning just after sunrise, a thermos of coffee in one hand and a copy of the old blueprints in the other. Mark Cullen had given him unrestricted access, trusting his persistence and the clear emotional weight behind his search. That passage beneath the bookcase now lay uncovered, the temporary plywood barricade removed, exposing the wooden door and the stone stairwell behind it. The flashlight beam cut through the gloom like a blade, illuminating dust particles and cobwebs that shimmered faintly in the stale air. Michael took each step slowly, testing the ground beneath his feet. The chill deepened as he descended, settling in his lungs. At the base of the stairs, the narrow hallway branched left into a smaller space they hadn't fully explored the day before. Michael paused, hesitated, then stepped through a warped wooden doorway into what felt like another hidden chamber. The room opened wider than expected, its walls rough and unfinished. 2 iron bed frames sat against opposite walls, rusted and stripped of mattresses. One had a frayed wool blanket crumpled in the corner, the other was bare. A rusted water basin and a small tin bucket stood in the far corner beside a toilet that hadn't been flushed in decades. A wooden bench rested against the wall, beside it an old wooden crate filled with dried candles, a chipped enamel cup, and 2 hand towels folded with surprising care. There was no light switch, no bulb, no wire that suggested electricity had ever touched this room. It was quiet, oppressively quiet, except for the faint sound of his breath bouncing back at him from the concrete. On the nearest wall, Michael noticed a series of faint pencil marks scratched into the paint in uneven strokes. Names, dates, notations like 3rd day of Lent, or barely visible in the grainy surface. As he leaned closer, he saw a cross etched into the stone, small and careful. Underneath, almost imperceptibly, someone had written, "Please don't forget us." The writing was light, almost childlike, as if written by someone whose hand trembled from hunger or fear. He knelt beside the crate, careful not to disturb anything, and opened a small wooden box half buried beneath the towels. Inside was an old paperback Bible, the spine cracked and softened from use. He opened it gently. The first few pages were blank. On the inside cover, in faded blue ink, was a line written in block capitals. "We were not allowed to leave. Sister Emily was too sick to travel. Please remember me." Michael's hands trembled as he read it again. The ink had bled slightly into the paper, the edges worn with time. On the next page another note had been added. "Sister Claudia says to pray for mercy." He sat back against the cold wall, the Bible still open in his hands, and tried to steady his breathing. The room was too intact, too human to have been abandoned casually. Someone, likely all 3 women, had lived here, slept here, waited here. Michael scanned the room again and noticed that the iron grate above one of the beds, likely a vent to the upper floors, had been partially stuffed with fabric, as if someone had tried to muffle sound or keep warm air from escaping. He stood and checked the opposite wall, where another faint scrawl appeared just beneath the plaster. This one was older, almost rubbed out by time, but he could still read it. Genevieve still believes they all come back for us. There was no date, no sign of when it had been written, just that single devastating sentence. Returning to the crate, he rifled gently through the rest of its contents. Among the candles and torn napkins was a small handmade rosary, strung together with frayed black thread and tiny carved wooden beads. At the center hung a crucifix, fashioned from 2 matchsticks bound together with what looked like a thread from a habit. The makeshift nature of it was heartbreaking. Michael slipped it into his coat pocket and stood. The air in the room was becoming harder to breathe, or maybe his chest had simply tightened too much to let air pass freely. He moved toward the back wall and pressed his hand against the concrete. Cold, solid. He scanned the ceiling. No other vent, no light source. This was not a room someone entered for an hour of reflection or quiet prayer. This was containment, deliberate, silent. He took a few pictures with his phone, documenting the room from every angle, and returned to the door where Cullen was now waiting halfway up the stairs. "You never went that far," Cullen said quietly. "Did you find something?" Michael nodded. "More than I wanted to." They stepped outside, letting the heavy door fall shut behind them. The cold sunlight felt too bright, too clean for what he had just seen. "There were 3 women," he said. "One of them was too sick to walk. They were left there." Cullen rubbed his hands together. "You think someone locked them in?" "I think someone never came back." They walked in silence back to Cullen's office. Michael sat down heavily in the chair opposite the desk, placing the Bible on the surface between them. Cullen picked it up carefully, flipping through the first few pages, his expression darkening as he read the messages inside. "Jesus," he whispered. "This really happened?" Michael said. "That handwriting, it's Claudia's and Emily mentioned by name." "He's found something else," Cullen said after a pause. He opened the lower drawer of his filing cabinet and pulled out a small plastic box. Inside was a tin spoon, its edge worn flat, the metal blackened at the tip. "One of our guys thought it was nothing, maybe used for stirring waxed Del Grey. But now?" Michael took it, turning it over in his palm. The base was engraved with 3 tiny letters. E.R. Emily Rowe. The last initial confirmed what the handwriting had already made clear. They had been here, they had lived, and at least one of them had tried to document it. Michael stood and moved toward the window. Outside, the grounds of the retreat center looked peaceful, renewed. Guests strolled along gravel paths, completely unaware of what had happened beneath their feet. "If I hadn't come," he said quietly, "they would have erased everything." Cullen didn't reply. He simply looked down at the Bible on the desk, then back at the open file in his hand. There might be more. Where? Michael turned, his voice sharp with urgency. Cullen hesitated. There was another hatch under the west wing, sealed off during reconstruction. We never reopened it because the foundation cracked nearby. But it's there. Michael grabbed his coat. "Take me there." The west wing had always been a secondary structure, a later addition to the original abbey, built during the mid-50s to house visiting clergy and surplus storage. By the time Michael and Cullen reached the rear entrance to what had once been its utility corridor, the sun had begun to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the gravel lot. Cullen produced a key from a labeled ring and unlocked the steel maintenance door, which groaned open to reveal a dark, narrow passage lined with cracked tile and rusted pipes. The air smelled like mildew and long-forgotten things. "The hatch is back there," Cullen said, pointing to a section of floor near the end of the hallway. The concrete was newer in patches, and a strip of paint indicated where the flooring had once been sealed. Michael dropped to his knees and began feeling along the seams. The faint outline of a square hatch became apparent beneath the layers of grime. With Cullen's help and a flathead crowbar, they prized it open. A rush of colder air surged up from below. A steep wooden ladder descended into the dark. "No utilities ever ran down there," Cullen muttered. No plans, no vents, nothing happy to see himself clutched in one hand, the other gripping the side rail. The space below was tight, barely 5 feet high, the ceiling supported by old wooden beams. But it widened into a shallow room, one that had clearly been used. In the corner, straw bedding remained in rotting piles. Rusted cans sat on makeshift shelves, and in the far corner, a curtain fashioned from a sheet hung loosely from a length of wire. Behind it, he found a cracked porcelain sink, a dented basin, and a metal pail. Unlike the previous chamber, this one showed signs of more recent presence. There were remnants of food packaging not more than 15 years old, a melted candle nub, and a pile of neatly folded cloth rags. Most chilling, however, was the faint but unmistakable indentation of a body having laid on the straw pile. Again and again, as if someone had remained there for a long time. Michael's heart pounded. Someone was living down here more recently. When they resurfaced, he barely spoke, just nodded to Cullen and asked if there were any remaining staff who had worked under the previous ownership before Haven Ridge took over. Cullen checked the old files and found a name, Marguerite Ellis, once a caretaker and domestic assistant, now retired and living in a Catholic-run elder care home in Corvallis. The next day, Michael drove to the address, a red brick building surrounded by well-tended gardens and shaded benches. The receptionist confirmed Sister Marguerite was still a resident. She doesn't get many visitors, she added, but she's sharp when she wants to be. They led him to a sunlit common room where several elderly nuns sat quietly knitting or reading. At a far corner, by a window that overlooked the garden, sat a thin woman with pale eyes and a gray shawl folded across her lap. When Michael introduced himself and mentioned St. Bellamy, she stiffened, but didn't look away. "You're not the first to ask about that place," she said quietly. "But you're the first to say the names out loud." He sat down gently. "Claudia and Emily Rowe, and Sister Genevieve Morales. You knew them?" "I was the one who brought them meals," she said. "Not for long, just a few weeks." "They were quarantined?" "Quarantined?" Michael repeated. "Yes. Sister Emily had a high fever. We thought it was influenza, maybe something worse. The head mother, Sister Bridget, said the best thing was isolation. The old rooms below the library had been used for illness before. They sent them down. Did they have medical care? Only what we could give them. Vitamins, broth. No one came from town. We weren't allowed to call anyone." "Why?" "Because obedience," Marguerite said, her voice dry. "Because silence. Because we were trained to accept decisions from above without question. The bishop had told us to handle our own. No scandal, no involvement from outside." Michael clenched his fists. "How long were they kept down there?" "Weeks, then the visit stopped. I wasn't told why. The next time I went near the stairs, the door was sealed." She paused. "We didn't ask questions. We were told they'd been transferred to a different clinic." "But you knew," Michael said. "Didn't you?" Marguerite's eyes welled. "I suspected, but suspicion is not permission. We were told that questioning was disobedience. That if we doubted the chain of command, we doubted the church. So no one helped them?" "We weren't allowed to," she whispered. "We were told they'd chosen silence, chosen to remain." "That's a lie. I know that now," she said, voice trembling. "But back then it was doctrine, rule of life. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't disobey. Don't involve the outside world." Michael sat back, breathing hard. Everything was clearer now. They weren't abandoned by accident. They had been hidden. Hidden under layers of policy, of deference, of institutional obedience, masquerading as faith. They were buried alive, he said, because someone was afraid of scandal, because someone believed obedience mattered more than truth. Sister Marguerite replied, "I pray for them every day, but I don't know if any of them survived." "I found a message," Michael said, "in the basement, written in a Bible. Claudia said Emily was too sick to leave. That's why they stayed." Marguerite closed her eyes. She was always the kind one, always looking after the others. Michael stood, uncertain what to say next. Before he could speak, she reached into a drawer beside her and pulled out a folded paper. "This came with me when I left the Abbey," she said. "I wasn't supposed to take anything, but I kept it." She handed it to him. The paper was stained and thin. Inside was a hand-copied prayer written in blue ink. At the bottom, 3 names were signed. Genevieve, Claudia, Emily. "That was the last thing I found on their tray," she said, "before they stopped collecting meals. I prayed it meant they were at peace, but now I don't know." Michael turned the note over and saw, on the back, a final line, "One day, someone will come." He folded it carefully and placed it in his coat pocket beside the rosary. That day is now. But as he stepped outside into the sun, he realized something else. If one of them had survived, she might still be out there, waiting, still praying, still believing someone would come. And if so, he was already 25 years too late. The return drive from Corvallis to the retreat center was quiet, the kind of silence that no radio could fill. Michael gripped the wheel, the prayer note still folded tightly in his coat pocket. His thoughts swirled with images of straw mats on cold stone floors, of scratch marks on old doors, and now Sister Marguerite's quiet confession echoed louder than anything else. Emily had been sick, they had been quarantined, and no one had ever come back for them. By the time he reached Haven Ridge, the sky was bruised with late afternoon clouds, and the forest surrounding the old abbey looked darker than usual. Cullen was waiting for him at the side entrance. "I spoke with one of the older contractors," Cullen said as they walked inside. "He helped with foundation work in 2003, back when the diocese still had title. He remembers hearing rumors that part of the property was off limits, but nothing more. No paperwork, no explanation." Michael followed him down the same hallway that led past the library and back to the base of the west wing. "Did you find anything else?" he asked. Cullen nodded, opening a locked closet door at the end of the hall. Inside, stacked among unused supplies, was a box marked Bellamy, Archive. Inside the box were several yellow service logs, handwritten by past caretakers, along with inventory slips and kitchen schedules. One entry, dated August 1995, was circled in red. "Tray not collected. No answer at door. Supervised to discontinue delivery. Chapel to handle." Another, 5 days later, simply read, "No sound for 2 days. Recommend closure." Michael's stomach turned as he read the lines again and again. Someone knew they were still down there. Someone chose to stop checking. "We need to open the second hatch," he said. Cullen hesitated. "That's under the original chapel foundation. It was marked unsafe when we bought the property. Cracks in the substructure. We have to try." That night, under floodlights and with the cautious help of a structural engineer on site, they cleared the debris covering the second entrance, this one beneath what had once been the east transept of the chapel. The hatch was metal, bolted shut. When the last bolt came loose and the lid lifted, a damp, earthy smell wafted upward. Michael descended first, the air colder than expected. The passage was tight and short, leading into a final chamber smaller than the others. It was cleaner somehow, as if someone had maintained it even in isolation. At the far wall stood a low wooden altar, beside it a bed frame covered in layered cloth. A crucifix hung on the wall, carved from wood and painted with faint gold strokes. And on the bed, covered gently in a linen shroud, was the unmistakable outline of human remains. Michael froze, staring. The bones were small, delicate. A rosary was still entwined in the fingers, and beside the head was a folded cloth with faint embroidery, "Emily." A wooden plaque had been nailed to the wall above her, "Died August 14th. May she rest in peace." He sank to his knees, whispering a prayer, tears stinging his eyes. She had died down here, alone except for her sisters, and someone had buried her as best they could, with reverence even in abandonment. Claudia's handwriting was unmistakable in the plaque. "She stayed," Michael murmured. "She stayed with her." The room offered more clues. In the corner sat a journal, its pages weathered but intact. Claudia's voice came through the entries, steady at first, then increasingly desperate. "Emily won't stop coughing. Sister Genevieve prays over her day and night. The air is cold, and the rags wet with breath. I fear we are too late. Then, days later, Emily has passed. We made her erratic gauge Genevieve. She believes we were left here for a reason. And finally, no one is coming. I am not afraid of death, only of forgetting." Michael flipped to the final page. There was a single line, "If you find this, tell them we were here." His hands trembled as he closed the journal. Stay behind, Cullen said softly from behind. She chose to remain, Michael nodded, because she wouldn't leave her sister. And Genevieve, Cullen pointed to the opposite corner. A small alcove partially sealed with stone. Inside were more remains, less preserved, as if the death had come quietly and long ago. A crucifix had been carved into the wall beside them. A note pinned with rusted tack read only, "She stopped speaking on the third Advent." "Genevieve," Michael whispered. The pieces aligned in a way that hurt more than it helped. Emily had fallen ill within the first weeks. Isolation had been imposed, not chosen. With no medicine and no support, she died of what likely began as a common respiratory infection. Genevieve had tried to make sense of the slow unraveling, clinging to prayer until her mind could no longer hold the weight. And Claudia had stayed with them both, refusing to abandon the bodies, choosing instead to wait, hoping against silence. But no one had come. Not because no one could, but because those who could were told not to, because silence was the rule, because scandal was worse than death. And eventually, when the food stopped arriving, when no voices answered back through the vent, Claudia had simply stopped writing. Michael stood in that chamber for a long time, surrounded by the dead, the quiet, and the cold stone that had outlived them all. The chapel above was long gone, demolished in the early 2000s, but the foundation remained, cracked, buried, and holding the weight of 3 women who had once believed their obedience would be answered with mercy. He touched the wall once more before climbing out, the journal pressed against his chest, the truth more unbearable than silence had ever been. The official records for St. Bellamy Abbey ended in late 2001, with a single line entered into the diocesan property ledger. Decommissioned due to structural decay and unsustainable operation costs, all assets transferred, no occupants remaining. It was a sentence that sounded like closure, but in fact marked the beginning of decades of silence. Michael, seated in the archives of the Portland Diocese, stared at the faded ink and shook his head. This was how history erased people, with administrative brevity. He flipped through the accompanying files. No final inspection forms, no exit logs, no property inventory, just a deed transfer dated November 19, 2001, signed by a junior member of the diocesan's team and received by a private holding company registered under the name Glen Haven. No board review, no pastoral letter, not even a farewell mass. St. Bellamy had simply ceased to exist on paper. But Michael knew what had been hidden beneath it. That basement, sealed and forgotten, had entombed 3 women alive, while the institution above them documented only maintenance costs. Cullen had managed to locate one final piece, a name scrawled in the corner of a facilities logbook, Sister Althea Ward, listed as the last caretaker assigned to the abbey. There was no forwarding address, but a handwritten note in the margin read, "Transferred to Sacred Oaks residence. Visual impairment progressing." It was a long shot, but Michael followed it. Sacred Oaks was a private religious home outside Salem, a peaceful cluster of red brick cottages ringed by oaks and hydrangea bushes. Inside the main building, a staff member confirmed that Sister Althea was still alive, though nearly 90 and completely blind. "Her mind comes and goes," the nurse said as she led him down the hallway. "But she remembers the abbey. She talks about it often." Sister Althea sat in a soft chair beside a radio playing Gregorian chant. Her hands, thin and covered in translucent skin, moved slowly as she knitted a single strand of yarn into an undefined shape. Michael approached gently. "Sister Althea, my name is Michael Rowe. I'm looking into St. Bellamy." She turned her head slightly, her face registering something between recognition and caution. "Bellamy," she repeated. "The stone chapel, the iron bell." "Yes," he said, kneeling beside her. "You were there at the end?" "I was," she said, voice gravelly but steady. "They told me to lock everything up. They said no one was left, just the bones of old wood and dust." "Did you ever go below, into the basements?" She paused. "There were 2, one beneath the chapel, one under the west wing. Did you ever check them?" "I was told not to. The mother house said all had departed, that the rest were accounted for. But I couldn't see. My eyes were already gone." Her voice faltered. "I couldn't know." Michael placed his hand over hers. My sisters were among those left behind, Claudia and Emily Rowe, and Sister Genevieve Morale. They never left. Dago held up his hand. I thought I heard voices once, through the floor, a song, a prayer, but when I asked, I was told it was memory, or wind, or my mind playing games. They said there was no one, that the last sisters had left in summer. Who told you that? Father Kassler and the visiting vicar. They came with boxes and contracts, took the chalice, the vestments, the tabernacle. Said the church had other priorities. She paused. They locked the chapel with 3 iron bolts, sealed the lower doors with chain and cement, said to let the past sleep. Michael felt rage rise in his chest. You never went down yourself? I couldn't. I barely made it up the stairs those last days. My hearing was fading too. I called out once. No one answered. Then the noise stopped altogether. I thought... She trailed off. I prayed I was wrong. You weren't, he said. They were still there. A tear escaped down her cheek, disappearing into the deep wrinkles of her face. Then I failed them. No, Michael said gently. You were told a lie. You were given silence and called it truth. She turned her face slightly toward the light. Then forgive me, Father. I should have questioned more. You did what you could. But even as he spoke, the weight of years pressed on him, the finality of concrete walls, the silence that had been labeled opium. The church had closed the books without opening the doors. Back at the retreat center, Cullen met him with news. I contacted the county assessor's office, he said. When the property changed hands in 2001, the disclosure paperwork listed the buildings as vacant, but there's a clause, status of lower-level spaces, inaccessible at time of transfer. Michael narrowed his eyes. So they knew there were sealed spaces, variantly, but no one followed up, no inspection, no mandate to verify. The sale was internal, clean on the books, no one questioned it. And Glen Haven Limited? Shell company, owned by a real estate broker who used to do quiet deals for religious organizations. It changed names 3 times before it landed with the current foundation. So no one was ever held accountable, Michael said. No bishop, no mother superior, no caretaker. They just turned the page. It gets worse, Cullen said. There's an internal memo archived from 1999, before the closure. It references sensitivity around the Bellamy site, recommending that any retreat assignments be paused until internal matters resolve. Mortal internal matters? The memo doesn't say, but the timing aligns with when the food deliveries stopped, when Claudia wrote her last entry. Michael stared at the copy of the memo, its neat church letterhead giving no hint of the lives buried behind it. They knew, he whispered. They knew someone might still be down there, and they left them. Said enough. Michael returned to the chapel ruins later that evening, standing where the altar had once stood. Beneath his feet, cold stone hid what no liturgy had ever acknowledged. He pictured the final days again, Emily's breath shallow, Genevieve's reciting prayers into the dark, Claudia marking the wall with days and hopes. No one had come, and when the church finally closed its doors, they did so with full knowledge that no one had checked. A few initials on a line, a property sold, a silence preserved. But now, that silence had cracked, and someone, somewhere, would have to answer. Michael returned to the lower chamber, beneath what had once been the east transept, this time with gloves, a flashlight, and a small notepad tucked into his jacket. The heavy silence of the room hadn't changed, but now it carried meaning, names, dates, and voices that had once filled it with life. As he moved carefully around the chamber, he noticed a narrow wooden crate tucked beside the rusted bed frame, where Genevieve's remains had been discovered. He crouched, wiped away the thick layer of dust, and slowly pried open the lid. Inside lay what appeared to be a bundle of personal items wrapped in faded cloth, carefully stored, deliberately preserved. He unwrapped the fabric with slow, reverent hands. The first object to emerge was a silver necklace with a narrow cross pendant, tarnished but unmistakable. He knew that necklace, had picked it out himself in a shop near Rome in 1988, the year Emily entered the novitiate. He had sent it home with a handwritten letter on the feast of St. Lucy, knowing how much his youngest sister admired symbols of quiet faith. Seeing it now, dulled by time but intact, was like hearing her voice call out through the years. No doubt lingered, this had been Emily's. Beneath it was another chain, this one slightly thicker, with a gold locket attached. The clasp had stiffened with age, but with care Michael opened it. Inside were 2 miniature photographs, grainy but still visible. The first showed Claudia in her novice veil, standing in front of a small chapel he remembered from their hometown. The second was of the 3 siblings, arms around each other in front of their family's porch. Claudia had worn that locket every day after Emily left for her final vows. Michael remembered giving it to her as a keepsake when he was ordained. "So you can keep us close, no matter how far we go," he'd said. There was no mistaking it. These were theirs. He set the necklaces aside gently, as if placing them on an altar. His eyes scanned the surrounding area until he noticed a small leather-bound book wedged between 2 stacked crates. Its corners were curled with moisture and age, but the spine was still intact. He opened the front cover. There was no name on the first page, only the word "Provisions." What followed was a series of careful entries listing food supplies, water rations, candles, and notes on basic needs. Each page was dated in Claudia's hand. The earliest entries began in September 1995. The last one, written in shaky but still deliberate script, was dated March 3, 1997. Michael ran his fingers over the final lines. Candles almost gone. Dried rice for 2 more weeks. Weather colder than usual. No response from above for months. Genevieve has not spoken in days. I pray in the dark now. He felt a hollow ache spread in his chest. This meant Claudia had survived nearly 2 full years after Emily's death, likely caring for Genevieve until she too passed. Alone, cut off, and still maintaining records. Still writing. Still hoping. He flipped back to a middle section, searching for any reference to Emily. One entry stood out. October 2, 1995. Emily's cough worsened overnight. No medicine left. Boiled cloth for steam. Genevieve sings hymns to calm her. I sleep beside her now just in case. A week later, October 9, 1995, tap Emily pass in her sleep. I washed her face, prayed. There was no light when I buried her. Michael closed the book slowly, not in haste but with reverence. This was not just a record of provisions. It was a chronicle of loss, of survival, of unrejoining devotion. He stood and moved to the small niche where he had previously found the remains. There he placed the notebook beside the wrapped items, not as evidence, but as memory reclaimed. There would be no need for DNA testing, no official identification procedures. These were his sisters, and the proof was more than genetic, it was spiritual, emotional, and personal. He had given them those tokens. He had written some of the letters Claudia had quoted in the margins. He knew her phrasing, her precise handwriting, the way she always dated her entries with both the calendar day and liturgical season. One note read, "First Sunday of Advent, Cleansman is Summit." Note read, months later, said only. Michael sank to the floor, the rough stone cold against his knees. The knowledge that Claudia had lived on, had continued the rhythm of faith through ritual and remembrance, broke something open inside him. Her silence had never been surrender. It had been devotion, resistance, and witness. From a small tin can near the crate, he pulled one last folded piece of paper. It was brittle, creased at the edges, and written in charcoal pencil. Define this. Let it be known. We kept the rule, we kept the faith. We did not leave. It was unsigned, but it bore Claudia's style unmistakably, a final act of clarity in a place meant to erase all evidence. Michael rose slowly, collecting the items into a cloth bundle. He would not leave them here. The world would know, and those responsible, whether by order or omission, would finally face the truth. But one question still lingered like an unfinished breath. Why had no one looked sooner? The day the memorial was installed, the woods surrounding the old grounds of St. Bellamy stood silent. It had rained early that morning, and the stone markers still held droplets along its edges. There were no cameras, no journalists, no diocesan representatives, just Michael, standing alone with a small bouquet of lilies and a folded piece of paper in his coat pocket. He had insisted that no ceremony be held, no press release issued, no names announced beyond the simple inscription he had requested. The memorial stood on a small incline overlooking where the chapel once had been, just above the two entrances, now sealed again with reinforced stone. It read, 3 women lived in silence, unknown and unseen. For their faith no one protected them, There were no surnames, no titles, only the truth etched plainly into polished granite. Michael stood for several minutes without speaking, letting the quiet absorb the weight of years that no one else had borne but him. He didn't need applause or apologies, didn't crave outrage or justice in the traditional sense. What had happened was beyond the reach of courts or committees. It was deeper than that, woven into happen. The bishop in Portland had offered to open an internal investigation after Michael submitted a private report, but he had declined. He gave them copies of the journal, the notes, the photographs, and a request that they do what conscience dictated, but he made it clear he would not be participating further. There was nothing left to argue, no justice that could reverse 3 decades of abandonment. In the weeks that followed, the story was picked up briefly by a local religious newsletter which ran a short piece titled "Forgotten Sisters Remembered After Basement Discovery." It was factual, brief, and cautious in tone. No media storm followed, no outrage erupted beyond the quiet murmurs of those who had once walked the halls of St. Bellamy or prayed in its pews. But within the local parishes, something did shift. People began to speak more openly about obedience and fear, about the times they had looked away or chosen not to ask questions, about what it meant to follow in silence and what it cost. An elderly deacon from a nearby town gave a homily 2 Sundays later that began with, "Sometimes holiness requires disobedience." Afterward, 2 young postulants left their convent without completing their vows, citing not anger but uncertainty about an institution that had yet to reckon with its silences. Michael returned to his small home near Corvallis, where he had once planned to retire into quiet pastoral care. But the collar no longer felt like his. It hung on the hook by his bedroom door for weeks, untouched. And one morning, without ceremony, he folded it and placed it in a box beside his seminary notebook, sealing it closed. He did not renounce his faith, but he did release his office. From that point on, he attended Mass from the back row, no longer at the altar, no longer reading from the pulpit. He prayed with the people, not above them. When asked, he simply said, "I've chosen a different form of witness." Occasionally, parishioners from Elder Glen would visit the memorial. They left candles, handwritten notes, sometimes flowers. A retired school teacher named Rosa Delmar, who had been taught by Sister Claudia as a child, sat for hours one afternoon, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. She taught us to speak truth, but no one ever gave her that gift in return. A local seminarian, moved by the story, started a project archiving forgotten histories of women religious in the Northwest. Another proposed that the memorial become a regular pilgrimage site during Lent, as a reminder that silence, too, can be a form of violence. Michael never corrected anyone's version of the story. He never expanded it, never dramatized it. He let it be what it was, a wound that didn't need narrative embellishment to break the heart. He often walked the trail behind the retreat center in the early mornings, hands in his coat pockets, eyes on the horizon. He didn't pray aloud anymore, but in his chest the rosary made from thread and wood that he had found beside Claudia's bed remained, always carried, never displayed. It was the only relic he permitted himself, one that had never been blessed by the Church but had been sanctified by suffering and faith. Years later, a new retreat complex was proposed on the same land, this time designed with wide-open chapels, transparent governance, and a vow that no space would ever again be sealed without inspection. Michael did not attend the opening, though he sent a letter that was read quietly by the new director during a staff retreat. It said only this: "If the Church is to mean anything, it must never choose image over people, silence over truth, or obedience over mercy." 3 women believed in us. We did not believe in them. May we never make that mistake again. No name was signed, no title attached, but everyone knew who had written it, and beneath the tall trees where the wind often sounded like hymns half remembered, the stone marker remained, non-moved, unspoken by officials, but never again unseen. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more haunting, true-inspired narratives like this. What part hit you the hardest? The silence, the discovery, or the choices made in faith? Let me know in the comments. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from?